in practice, lived out this sense of universality of the Christian faith. And so in the early church, Greeks became Christians on their own terms as Greeks, using the language. Others used Latin, and still others, Syriac and Coptic. This trend of people groups becoming Christian in terms of their heritage and languages continued until the 6th century. According to Walls, it was the 6th century that brought, quote, the great ecumenical failure that divided between those who did their theological thinking in Greek and Latin from those who did it in Syriac and Coptic, end of quote. He continues that this, quote, developed the concept of an empire-wide rather than a worldwide church, cut off Christians of Europe from the Christians of Africa and Asia, and divided the church along linguistic and cultural lines that made all the later such divisions easier, end of quote. With this development, it became easier for missionaries to depart from the paradigm set at the Jerusalem Council and reflected in the letter to the Ephesians, and for them to impose heritage-based Christianity on their converts. And that, unfortunately, became the experience, to a great extent, of Africans in the modern missionary era. The European migration of the last years of the 16th century, that according to Walls ended after the Second World War, took place from Europe to the Americas, Australia, and of course to Africa in terms of the scramble for Africa. All of these migrations took place without any issues pertaining to visas. Meanwhile, from the 17th and especially 18th centuries, the intellectual movement in Europe, known as the Enlightenment, had been initiated and soon taking hold. Human reason became the fundamental basis of authority and legitimacy, and through it, individualism, personal freedom, and secularism were all promoted. What was reasonable was what could be touched and handled. And skepticism towards everything else, especially everything spiritual, increased. Thus, there grew a strong division between the physical and spiritual realms, with many not believing that the latter, the spiritual realm, even existed. In effect, this Enlightenment movement undermined the primal, and effectively speaking, ultimately turned the individual into a god. One west of the Bible and the view of the God of the Bible. The repercussions of this development continue today in the Western Theological Academy, the church in the West, and indeed Western society at large. It is this Enlightenment jaundiced Christianity that European missionaries brought to Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. In spite of the shift in the center of gravity of Christianity to Africa and other southern continents, this brand of Western Christianity continues to wield influence in Africa and elsewhere. And it is this scenario that brings in grave relief the theological challenge of world Christianity. In effect, Christianity is not being theologically global enough the way that world Christianity is supposed to be. That is, the way it was originally set out in the primitive church as we encounter in the Bible. World Christianity as a discipline, as initiated by Walls and others, is meant to be a corrective to this Western Enlightenment-driven form of Christianity. And so, Chair, at this point, we must pose the question, what is Africa's place in this enterprise? So, I turn my attention now to the African dimension, to the theological challenge of world Christianity. In picking up on the African dimension to the theological challenge of world Christianity, we would want to first look at the nature of the African challenge. Here, there are both external and internal factors to consider. So first, we'll look at the external factors. As hinted earlier, Western Christianity continues to exercise a great deal of influence in the non-Western world. In Africa, there's little doubt that this continuing influence is related to historical, socioeconomic, and indeed political factors. Historically, as noted, the Christianity brought by European missionaries was Enlightenment informed. In that regard, it was at variance with the experience of Africans with their primary religious background, and with the kind of Christianity that Africans encountered in the Bible, which, of course, is a kind of Christianity that has a primal outlook. Moreover, missionary Christianity got entangled with colonialism, and that involved the economic exploitation of the continent. The socioeconomic structures put in place in colonial times continue in a neo-colonial fashion, sustaining a continuing exploitation of the continent's natural resources to the detriment of the continent's development. The influence of the Western Theological Academy, with its Enlightenment baggage, continues in various ways and at various levels, whether in terms of publication avenues and professional guilds. Politically, Western countries with so-called Christian values seek to impose their values on Africa, even when Africans see that their reading of Scripture and their own cultural values do not accept such values. Even though this continuing influence of the West is the reality, it is extremely difficult to appreciate why this should be the case. Chairperson, Christianity is in obvious recession in the West. And there are many aspects of Western Christianity that many Christians in the non-Western world believe are not Christian and certainly not biblical. In the US, for example, it appears that there are two irreconcilable extremes at play, with probably only a few Christians caught in the middle. On the one hand, There is the issue of how the gospel should engage with American culture, wherein many Christians appear to have thrown in the towel, and so the church, true to the Enlightenment elevation of the individual into a God, is ready to allow the individual to have the final say no matter what. And so the individual, for instance, determines what and who they are. If someone says, I'm a cat, so be it. If the female says, I'm a male, so be it. If I wish to marry a person of my own sex, so be it. The individual has become a law unto himself or herself, with hardly any reference to community, or for that matter, any sense of community. That is one side of the coin. On the other extreme are those who, not knowing how to engage the gospel with the current developments in American culture, believe that the way out is for them to seize power and legislate the things that they cannot convince others about, but they believe are Christian, but for them, the things they can't convince people about, but in their own view, things that they believe are unchristian or unbiblical. So-called evangelical Christians are pursuing Christian nationalism and adopting an approach that is no different from the Pharisaic legalism that Jesus condemned. We see at work in this venture blatant racism, Zionism, and anti-immigration that is being pursued with venom. Ironically, coming from people who themselves are not Native Americans, and so are immigrants or descendants of immigrants who never needed visas to go to the Americas, or for that matter, to come to Africa to come and exploit the continent. Those who are caught in the middle of these two extremes are obviously in the minority, and it is extremely difficult to have their voices heard and for them to make a difference. Of course, they cannot give up. They must keep going. In essence, though,